Start on time. My name is Trisha Harris, and like I said, you're in the how to increase engagement in team meetings. I will be your host today, and I will be asking you questions in the chat, and you can ask questions as well. So I'll be answering questions, and I am joined by my coworker and the co-founder of Lucid Meetings, Elise Keith. She will be the presenter today. She has a great number of tips and techniques for everyone, and so we are excited to show you exactly how to keep people engaged. For a little housekeeping, we will be running for about 50 minutes, followed by Q&A. Of course, we'll give a little time for that, but like I said, definitely ask as you go, and we will have the recording afterwards once this is over, so look for that in your email inbox. The chat is open. Definitely start to engage. And one little housekeeping thing, I can see the chat on your screen, Elise, so you're welcome to let go of that and if you can. But otherwise, I'm going to let her begin and we can start the webinar.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Here's an overview of the topics we're going to cover today. And as you can see, we're going to talk a lot about relevant meeting research, part of which tells us that it's important to set and meet expectations with any meeting if you want it to be high quality. We work to do that for you today in the invitation in advance and with the short survey that many of you filled out. I thank you. About half of you filled that out, so thank you very much for taking the time to do that. Now, speaking of time, time is our big limitation today. We have way more to talk about on this topic than we can fit into an hour. So my team and I were working together to put an online course together. It's going to give us more time to go into these topics in more depth. If that's something you might be interested in later, go ahead and keep your eye out. We'll be sending out more information on that one shortly. And for those of you who are watching out for the sales pitch, that was it. If you're expecting today for us to demo our software or to talk more about our services, please know we'd love to talk to you about those things, but that's not going to happen in today's webinar. Now, I'm going to see if I can get my notes to be just a little bigger so I can see them. Brilliant. So this webinar is a webinar about engagement, and that's kind of a funny thing because webinars are not one of those times where people actually anticipate engaging. In fact, I know a lot of people registered today just so they could get the recording later. They don't actually intend to show up at all. And that brings me to my first key concept about engagement, and that is engagement is a choice. I'm hoping that those of you who are here will choose to engage. As Trisha mentioned, the chat is open, so you're welcome to go ahead and talk in there. I also know that some people find the chat really distracting during a presentation and think it's a little rude. So if that's you, go ahead and turn it off. Again, engagement is a choice. I'm going to do my best to make this interesting for you and to help keep you on track. And with that, let's start talking about what we mean when we say engagement. So when we look at engagement at Lucid Meetings, we're looking at behavior across a whole range of different things. There's a spectrum, and at one end we have this dysfunctional, disruptive behavior. You've got things like people showing late or people interrupting. This is actually the realm of the dominant folks, the folks who override and sit on top of other people's discussions and who are insulting, personal attacks. That's the dysfunctional, disruptive behavior. Moving up the spectrum, we get the distracted behavior. You know, the people who are doing other work, the side conversations, the technology. And then next to that, we get this next level of behavior, which is attentive, right? People may be listening, they may be nodding along, they may be taking personal notes. But there's a challenge here because between distracted and attentive, it's really kind of tricky to tell the difference between somebody who's listening to you and somebody who's looking at you but thinking about lunch. So when we are after engagement, we're trying to move people over to this right side of acceptable into participating. Now the first level here is participating, and these are the people who respond when spoken to, right? You ask a question, they answer it. They may engage with other groups and have small group discussion and whatnot. It's reactive. When prompted, they engage, but at least you know they're in the meeting. The next level up is the set of folks who are actively contributing to the result. So these will be your people who are giving presentations, who are offering ideas, who are putting out questions. I'm guessing we have a couple of facilitators joining us today, that you might have some folks contributing today in the chat that are helping build a bigger result from here than we can do on our own, and that would be great. And then the final level is ownership. So people who are owning the meeting result. This is obviously the meeting leader, but it can also be someone who is taking charge of driving a decision or helping set the topic. Now, when we talk about engagement, it's important to realize that all of these people may be engaged. Your disruptive people may be highly engaged in your meeting. We're after this right side of acceptable when we talk about engagement. Today, it's often very, very common for us to blame technology for some of these unacceptable behaviors, for our short attention spans and whatnot. But I think it's important to know that this is not anywhere near a new problem. In fact, take a look at this. So this is a quote from the 14th century guild meetings, where they put down this rule that said that the chairs were able to issue on-the-spot fines to anybody who spoke without permission or incited others or, became rebellious and indecent. Like, they could fine them in the meeting if they were disruptive. And yet, as severe as this is, they found it wasn't enough, because in 1457, they upped the ante. They changed the rule that said that those who were dealing with outside business during the meetings could be condemned to death. So, disruptive behavior in meetings has always been a problem, and it's always been something that we've been struggling with as a society. So what are the specific behaviors we're trying to change today? Well, we asked that question in the survey, and here's kind of where your answers fell. The most people who answered, about half of you did, felt that, people not speaking up and contributing, this attentive but not participating was a big challenge. But as you can see, these challenge spans the range of different kinds of behavior. And as our historical glimpse shows, keeping people on track in meetings is again, a timeless challenge. It applies to people. The folks who registered for this webinar come from all different industries. It's not just a business challenge. We've got folks from the church. We have folks from the nonprofit world, from government. It's all over the place. Now, while the challenge is universal, our next key concept, I think, is something very important to keep in mind, and something you'll hear from us often. And that's, while the challenge is universal, your solution will be SMART. And those of you who have used SMART goals will recognize this: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timed. Your specific approach to how you fix things in your meetings will be specific to your meetings. As we go through this webinar, I encourage you to start drafting a SMART goal for yourself. In terms of the timed part of your SMART goal, I ask you to look at the meetings that you have on your calendar for the next 2 weeks. And as we go through, and when I give you tips and I show you different techniques, find one that you think you can apply in one of your meetings for the next 2 weeks. Later on in the chat, we'll be asking you to share any SMART goal that you come up with. Now, I know it can be really scary to try out new techniques with a whole group of people, but it's great that you're taking on this challenge, because the research that we have from the academic world shows that the people in your meetings want better engagement too. So let's go ahead and dive into what some of the research says. The first study we're going to look at is a study called Meeting Design Characteristics and Attendee Perceptions of Staff Team Meeting Quality, and it's from 2011. And the team there looked at trying to figure out whether all the best practice stuff, like using an agenda and keeping meetings short and all of that, actually made a difference. And here's the short version of their conclusion. They felt that when someone feels that they participated, so participated to the right side of acceptable in a high quality meeting, he or she feels that the time was well spent. So what does a high quality meeting look like? Well, they found that it didn't actually have so much to do with whether you used an agenda or any of the specific techniques. High quality is defined as the people knew in advance what to expect, and then those expectations were met, right? So if it was going to be an hour, it's an hour. We'll try to do that today. Let's keep moving. Our own studies find very, very similar things. So we ask this question all the time in different surveys, and the answers we get back are overwhelmingly about clarity. Clarity about the meetings being held, clarity about results, about why they need to be there, why is it relevant to them. So the research shows that people actively want to participate. They want to be in meetings that have a clear purpose, that produce tangible results, and that are relevant to their jobs. Beyond satisfaction with a meeting, we also have research that indicates that what happens in meetings has a large impact in what happens to your organization. These are 3 different studies I'll talk about real quickly. One of them found that when managers ran relevant meetings that allowed for employee voice, that overall employee engagement scores went up pretty dramatically. Another one found that when leaders in their meetings expressed the interests and support of the organization for the employees, then it changed the way that those employees related to the organization itself. So let me restate that. When the meetings showed that the organization cared about the employees' opinions and the employees' well-being, it invoked the reciprocity principle, right? They were cared about, and in return, they cared about the organization's well-being. Significant performance impact. And while we think these kinds of things would obviously apply to the good-natured among us, the final study looked at people who have a higher degree of negative affectivity. In other words, sort of the downer folks who are kind of negative about things in general. And in general, you would think that people who are negative about the organization are more likely to quit. And that's true. In this study, however, they found that if the employee had a high quality meeting with their manager, that intention to quit, even if they were sort of a negative person to begin with, went away. They were no more likely to quit than anyone else. Employee retention was up. So those are some specific meeting-related studies. Now, in that meeting-specific research, we see this emphasis on voice and focus and relevance and authentic relationships come up again and again and again. And that echoes findings we saw from Google when they looked at their people analytics team, looked at what created high-performance teams at Google. And there, they went in thinking that you'd get the best results if you've got the best people together on a team. Get yourself an awesome engineer, get a really smart designer, boom, best team. But what they found instead was that high-performing teams needed psychological safety. So this is about whether they feel like they could raise an issue and a concern, and whether it was safe to make mistakes in front of that group, right? They also needed things like dependability, whether they could count on each other. And then finally, structure and clarity. Clarity, there's that word again, right? You'll see that over and over and over again about how you conduct yourself and how you do your work together. So to recap, the research suggests that people want their voice heard, and they want to know that they make a difference. Managers who run engaging meetings that get everyone participating increase job satisfaction and employee retention. And that when teams engage in healthy, structured ways that build trust in their meetings, their performance outpaces the performance of teams made out of exceptional individuals. Which begs the question, what's getting in the way? If everybody wants it and it works better, why are we not doing this more? Well, let's look at what's getting in the way for the participants themselves first. And for those of you, about a third of the folks on this webinar are participants. See if you recognize any of these of your own, okay? Number one, lack of perceived relevance. So people may not understand how the meeting is relevant to their work, what it's meant to accomplish, or they may know why it's relevant to them, but they may not know why anyone else in the room would find their contribution relevant. Beyond relevant, they all may also worry about how they'll be received. And as Amy Edmondson says, turns out no one wakes up in the morning wanting to look ignorant, incompetent, intrusive, or negative. Now, Amy Edmondson actually is a Harvard researcher, and she is the originator of the term psychological safety. And when someone isn't clear how they're going to be received, and they get a negative reaction, it's triggering anxiety in the brain. Now, Amy's work looked into why people didn't speak up when they saw mistakes being made. Like, why does the nurse not speak up when she sees that the medication dosage the doctor's given is wrong? And it's this lack of psychological safety. Now, and that, you know, when we feel threatened psychologically like that, we learn that the way not to look ignorant, incompetent, or negative is to just keep our mouths shut, right? Most of us. Now, there's another side to psychological safety. And I think this model from Dr. Dan Siegel that he uses with children is really a fabulous way to look at it. In the brain, we have different layers, and this is the hand model. And when we are stressed or tired, or our buttons are being pushed, or something's triggering us, we flip our lid, right? Losing access to the higher reasoning or the logical thinking parts of the brain in the cortex and reacting directly out of the limbic system and the brain stem. So this is our fight, flight, or freeze mechanism coming into play, right? So for your people who are not speaking, that can be a fear reaction. Also for your people who are attacking, who are dominating, who are taking up more than their space, that can also be sort of a fear-based reaction. We want to do things in our meetings that help people keep their lids on, okay? So psychological safety is a big deal. But even the most calm and least threatened people can be easily distracted. We've already talked about technology. Now, our work with Paul Axtell, he taught us that there were actually six different fields of distraction we need to keep in mind. The first, of course, is technology. The second, physical pain. Physical pain is highly distracting, as is emotional pain. Anyone who's experiencing personal physical pain or emotional pain isn't going to be in a place to engage in your meetings. Beyond pain, we also have this issue of unfinished business. And in this case, we're talking about like that big list of little things that you just haven't quite finished up. You know, is my car clean? I think I forgot to send that report. The estimates say that we each have between 70 and 90 little niggles on our list that are keeping us back. So that's a bit of distraction. Multitasking is an obvious one. And finally, distracting yourself. So checking the internet, but also dwelling on regrets, emotions, all kinds of things like that can keep you from participating in the meeting. So those are some of the things that come up for participants that you as meeting leaders can't necessarily control, but there are things that you should be aware of and keep in mind. Now let's talk about what the leaders are doing, right? Our 4 deadly dozers. Number 1, the mystery meeting. So when you're not clear about the meeting purpose or the relevance, you know, what's in it for people, this causes people not to be able to engage very well. Another version of the mystery meeting, you know, when the boss is suddenly there, right? This happened to me when I was working in e-discovery. I used to participate in the executive leadership meetings, and one day I walked in and the chairman of the board was just sitting over there in the corner. And nobody said anything about why he might be there. You know, that was a meeting where engagement dropped rather dramatically. So there's another way that leaders may be unintentionally making people feel confused or irrelevant, and that's the what we call the third wheel syndrome. So we talked about how people need to feel relevant and that their voice is needed. And when there are too many people in the room, especially if there are extra people that aren't directly involved in the topic at hand, everyone's participation drops. So the studies show that the optimal team sizes are between, 5 to 7. And that's a lot of that's just because it's a lot easier to get everybody's voice out when there are fewer people in the room. Those of you who are dealing with large groups, also you might want to look into the phenomenon of social loafing. So that's when there's a large group and you ask a question and everybody takes a step back and assumes that, I'm sure Fred's got it, right? Third wheel syndrome. Watch out for that one. Next, remedial reading class. Most of your employees are literate and can read for themselves. Not only can they read for themselves, they can read a lot faster than you can read out loud to them. I think reading slides to adults as if they were kindergartners is deadly. It shuts them down. So, I'm sure you've heard the common term for this is death by PowerPoint. So let's not spend any more time reading this one, shall we? Our last engagement killer is this. Get people on a call with nothing to look at. Ask some vague questions, let the conversation ramble for a while. Anybody who's joined our meeting at this moment has no idea what we're talking about. They have no idea how to connect in with what we're doing. So don't let people draw blanks. Give them something to engage with. So those are our 4 most common engagement killers. Now, there's an overriding theme. We ask people when we see them doing these things why they do them. And a lot of what's happening is that leaders are just perpetuating unsuccessful practices. And we're like, well, why do you do this if it doesn't work? And they will tell us things like, that's how the other teams do it. Or I know how to talk. What should be so hard about it? Or we've always met this way. And we hear, I was taught to do it this way. My Agile coach said I had to do it exactly this way. Or finally, I know how to meet. It's the other people who need to get their act together. And I don't have time. I don't have time to focus on it. So watch for this. If any of that's coming up for you, those are traps. So let's recap on the challenge real quick. Engagement is a choice. On the spectrum of engagement, some things are better than others. People want to participate in relevant meetings, most of them. Let's be honest, most of them want to participate. That engagement impacts how they're going to perform in their job satisfaction overall. Your participants are struggling with relevance, safety, distractions, and leaders are struggling with all kinds of other things. With that, I'm going to have a sip of water and then let's talk about how to do something about it, shall we?
Yeah, thanks everybody for all your feedback. Everybody's contributing and giving examples and helping out here. So
awesome.
I'm sure there'll be more as we go.
Okay, cool. So let's start. We're going to get into specific techniques in a bit, but I'm going to start with 5 high-level steps for increasing engagement. These are key concepts that apply to every one of your meetings and all of the different, and regardless of the specific techniques that you decide to use. So the first one is to define the desired engagement. And I hesitated to put this on the list because when you put it on a list like this, it just seems so obvious. And yet this is the step I see people miss most often. And it's because it means you have to get really quite specific. So let me give you a very simple example. It's not unusual to see an invitation that looks something like, come to our Q4 planning meeting. Now, that doesn't cut it. You need to get more specific. How about review the Q3 performance and come to the Q4 planning meeting with your number 1 lesson learned and up to 3 recommendations for Q4. Not a brilliant example? Way better. That person understands what kind of contribution they're meant to be making and a way that their voice is going to be reflected in that meeting. Which brings us to step 2. Once you've defined what you want in terms of engagement, you need to ask for it. Another step, which is surprisingly often missed, people who say, nobody's speaking up, have you asked them to, right? It's easy to make an assumption there. So the ask can come in a lot of forms. You can ask people to complete prep assignments like we just mentioned. You can ask them to do things, reply, contribute, the obvious stuff. You can ask them to abide by ground rules. We had a post about this last week, so if that is something you're interested, go check that out. And finally, you can ask them to do a job. In this case, we've asked you to engage with Trisha to write your SMART goals. You can also ask people to be a facilitator or a note taker or a vibes watcher. Asking Nancy, I don't know if Nancy joined us today, but Nancy Sylvester is a facilitator who teaches remote teams how to be effective and engage across cultures. And one thing that she is always saying is to get people to multitask on task. And that's what this larger job does. It gives people a job that gives them a way that they are actively engaged in making that meeting successful. Now, on our list, asking for engagement is only step 2. And to help illustrate why that's the case, I want to tell you a story about a statistics class I took about 10 years ago. It was this late night class, and there were like 40 people in the class. And, late night class, 40 people, about 15 minutes in, half of them were asleep. And so the instructor had developed this habit where he would write what we were doing on the board, and about every couple of minutes, he'd pause and he'd go, questions? No questions. He never even looked around. He never turned around to see if we had any questions. So the kind of engagement he wanted was super clear, and he asked for it. But he just blew past step 3, which is to make sure you make space for the engagement. So if you ask for engagement, you must make sure there is time and space for people to give it to you. I'll cover some specific techniques about how to do that, but before we get into that, let's just do some math. So if each person in your meeting gives a 2-minute update and you've got 30 minutes, 2 people leaves 26 minutes for you to talk about the business at hand. 4 people, you've got 22 minutes, still doable. Whew, we're getting down to where we're mostly updates and not quite so much time for business. And then finally, you get to a tipping point. Something has to change. If you add more people, you have to choose. Do you change the kind of engagement you're asking for? That's step 1. Or do you make your meeting longer? Or do you invite fewer people, right? So you have to make space for engagement. Now the next 2 steps are a little bit less obvious. The next one is to acknowledge contributions. When people make a contribution in your meetings, say thank you. Acknowledge it at the very least. If it's relevant and it's substantive, write it down, right? That makes it part of the meeting record. This works to counteract 2 of the barriers to engagement that we talked about earlier. First, when you acknowledge a contribution, you let that person know that they were heard and that they have relevance to the team. Sometimes letting someone know that they have been heard clearly is a great way to get them to stop talking when you have those high over contributors. Hey, Fred, we've got your point. I've got a headline here. Thank you. The other thing is remember the flip the lid conversation. For a lot of folks, speaking up in a meeting means taking a risk. Some people are shy. Some environments are frankly hostile. So when you reward that risk, when you acknowledge that risk, you make that safer to have done. Now, if you instead dismiss it, don't acknowledge it, or fail to make space for this contribution that they've prepared altogether, you've taught them that it's not safe to make that risk, right? You will have lost that contribution going forward. And the final step in our 5-step process applies to all phases of your meetings. And that is, once you've asked people to make a contribution, make sure that you use what you receive. What happens in the meeting needs to make its way out of the meeting. Engagement for engagement's sake is a mistake. Now, this is a problem that we see really quite frequently with strategic planning sessions. You can run a fabulously engaging strategic planning meeting and come up with all of these great ideas, excuse me, only to take that plan and then put it on the shelf for a year, right? So if all that exciting thinking you did in the meeting has no impact, if it doesn't actually change anything that comes after the meeting, everyone in that group knows that that was a waste of time. Pretty soon, all that great engagement you built up in your first few meetings dries up, and in some cases, you'll find that people don't even start showing up anymore. This is also a big challenge that people run into with retrospectives. A retrospective can be an incredibly powerful tool for making change if you use it to make change. If you're not going to use the change, don't even do it. Just don't hold them. Be committed. Use what you receive. Okay, so that's our 5-step process when it comes to engagement. Use it or lose it. Quick recap. To make sure you get engagement in your meeting, you need to define it. You need to ask for that engagement, make space for it, acknowledge it, and then use what you receive. And now, with that, we're going to move into specific techniques. After I have another drink of water. All right. So this was kind of fun to put together. There are a bazillion techniques for running different kinds of engagement activities in meetings. And as we picked the 6 that we were going to share today, we looked out across all of the literature. The ones that we chose show up over and over and over again in all kinds of different forms. They're kind of like master recipes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each technique. I'm going to tell you what it is at a basic level, and then I'm going to give you some specific examples about how different teams have applied that technique in a way that's contextually appropriate for their work. As I was getting ready for this, I spoke to many of my facilitator friends and I asked them, what's the number one thing that you tell your clients, your non-facilitator clients, that they should be doing to get better engagement in their meetings? And every single one of them said this first tip, which is the check-in. So the check-in is something that helps you open your meeting by clearing, so getting rid of those distractions and connecting to each other. There are a couple rules about how you run a successful check-in. Number 1, get everyone participating within the first 5 minutes of your meeting. So this gets all of the voices into the room right away and showing people both that their participation is wanted and also, handily, that this isn't going to be a time to check their email. They are, in fact, expected to be speaking in this meeting. Now, to help also alleviate some of that anxiety, to help people with their lids, you want to make sure that your check-in is positive. We don't start a check-in talking about what sucks. We talk about what we accomplished or how things are going. You want to make it safe. And ideally, you want to make it relevant to the meeting at hand, your topic at hand. Let's see some examples. Okay, so this is a little long, but I couldn't help it. When you start looking at movies and literature and you think about the check-in, you're going to see check-ins everywhere, right? This is an ancient and a foundational tactic. And my first 2 examples are actually coming from history. Number 1 is the 3 security questions. The 3 security questions are these questions that were asked in medieval Europe when bands of warriors would come together to meet. Now, bands of warriors coming together to meet, these are armed men traveling distance and showing up at the same place. And the first thing that happened was they were asked the 3 security questions, which are the time, the place, and the people appropriate for this meeting? This is not a given, right? You could show up at this meeting and you could be faced across from your rival. And there were many incidences that, did not end happily for some of those people. So if anybody said no, they had a real debate about this, then those people were ejected from the meeting. And then the rest of the people who were there would take their swords and their ropes and whatnot, and they would make a circle, and the official would then sanctify that space and declare the peace of the order, right? And then they were able to begin their meeting. He also declared, no interrupting other people while talking and things like that. Some basic ground rules. We can see echoes of the 3 security questions. They were literally on the books in many cases until well into the 1800s. But you can see echoes of the 3 security questions when you show up to a parliamentary meeting and there's a call to order. The peace of the order, the call to the order, direct descendants. Now, our friends earlier who are liking to hang the people who do other outside business, they had a ritual that's a little bit softer. It's called the potasio, or the potation, for opening their afternoon sessions. And that is basically a big fat drinking session. So they would open the afternoon meetings with a toast to the absent and the departed guild members and the king, and let's see, can we toast some saints, and all of that kind of stuff. So they would toast, and that's how they cleared and they came together. That one we can see echoes of actually in modern team meetings. Starbucks actually starts their team meetings with a coffee tasting. Not quite as drunken, but very relevant to their business and a nice transition from whatever they were doing before. Let's go ahead and take a look at some more modern examples. The energy meter and the weather report. The energy meter is something that I learned from a lady at Zingerman's. They begin their meetings by saying, how are you doing today on a scale of 1 to 10? What's your energy like? 10 being, yes, awesome, I'm ready to go. And 1 being, I'm dead. And they have said that, basically if anybody reports that there are 5 or below, they send them home, right? They have a chance to be human and to talk about what's going on in their day. The second one is from Diana Larson, actually, and this is something she developed to help her Agile teams that meet once a week keep track of how they're doing on their work, and it's called the weather report. So when they show up, they say, if you were to give a weather report for how work was this week past, what would it be? And they would say things like, it was kind of foggy. I thought that was going to be easier, but I really couldn't see how to get through the work, that kind of thing. And they go around and talk about that. They then use this as a checkout. So after they've made the plans for the meeting, at the end, they'll say, what's your forecast for the next week? And they do the same thing. I have one more example on the check-in. And that's from this gentleman. Now, 3 things that are important about his story. And I encourage you to go ahead and follow this link and watch it on KarmaTube later. He and his team start meetings with a moment of silence, actually a full minute of silence. There are 3 things that are important about that. Number 1, it scales, right? Some of these other ones where you're asking everybody how they're doing, hard to fit into a large team. But a moment of silence you can do with a large group all at once. Number 2, this gentleman is a participant. He was not the meeting leader. He made this suggestion to his boss. You do not have to be the meeting leader to be the inspiration for change. And number 3, if you think that's too fuzzy and too soft and too fluffy, he is an investment banker. So I find that example to be a useful example. It also helps us see that engagement and becoming present and participation does not necessarily have to be verbal. So I talked earlier about SMART goals. Let's put together an example about SMART goals using a check-in. I'm only going to do this once, but it's to help connect this together so that you can really take what we're talking about here today and use it. So as a meeting leader, here's an example. For the next 2 weeks, I will make sure everyone speaks within the first 5 minutes of every meeting I lead. That's an example of using the check-in for a leader. If you are not a leader, as a participant for the next 2 weeks, I will participate within the first 5 minutes of every meeting I attend. And if there is not an opportunity to do so, I will speak to the meeting leader. Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timed. See what you can do with that. And that's technique number 1. So that's the check-in. Let's move on. Number 2, make visible progress by making progress visual. And we talked about earlier the drawing blanks thing. Making it so that people can see where you are helps an enormous amount. So visible progress in a meeting means that everyone can see where you are in the process. I don't know if you've noticed, but at the very bottom of every slide, it's telling you that we're on topic 6 of 7. We're making great progress through this here webinar. It also means that everyone can see meeting results. So not just progress through the meeting, but progress towards the achievement of something tangible. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of what that looks like. Here's a visual agenda with checkpoints. So you can take one way of doing your agenda, put the topics as sticky notes in the to-do column. As you do them, move them to doing, and as you complete them, move them to done. This is very similar to a Kanban board if somebody's used that. If you're working online, there are software tools that help you do that as well. Next up, let's talk about making results visible. So visual note-taking. Now, visual note-taking is so important to helping meetings feel productive and for making sure that what happens in that meeting becomes usable afterwards, that we consider this to be a core competency. And I'm going to show you a couple of ways that might look if you are in person. The first is the visually captured notes, right? So this is the kind of thing we're used to seeing when the facilitator shows up and people talk and they say, yes, Fred, I've got it, right? The next one, which is even more engaging, is the visually contributed contribution. So if you ask somebody to bring something, have them literally write it down, come up and post it in a place where people can see. Their contribution is given in a very obvious, engaged way. My third example on this visible progress theme is actually from the Lucid Meetings platform. So you should not be too surprised to know that a lot of these concepts are baked into our software. And across the top, we have the visual agenda so people can track where they are in the process. And at the bottom, we have the visual note-taking so that we can all see what we're capturing. The third kind of visible progress concerns not just what's happening in this meeting, but what's happening from meeting to meeting to meeting. We call that traveling lists. In this case, this is our marketing working session. And throughout our week, we write down things that we might want to work on in a marketing context. And then when we appear in our meeting, that list is automatically there. It's a used piece of information that we have available and we keep visible and working through all of our conversations. You can do the same thing with an issues list or an action items list, not just in Lucid. If you have a piece of paper, you can do it in a piece of paper. Lean teams often have a visual wall that keeps their list traveling from one meeting to the next. So that is visible progress. I think we're ready to move on to technique number 3. Ask better questions. It seems kind of obvious again, but I will tell you, Lucid Meetings team, we put out meeting agenda templates that tell people how to run kickoffs and check-ins and all kinds of things. And afterwards, we have a survey that goes out and we ask people for feedback. And the number one most common comment we get back was, it was so useful to know how to word that question. Asking the right questions makes a huge difference. To get some examples about why this can go wrong, let's look at some questions that inhibit engagement. Some, they're not bad questions, but they aren't questions that really get people participating. The first set are questions that are just easy to ignore. Any feedback? What do you think? Any questions? Questions, no questions. You can pretend that nobody answered that, and people also can pretend that they don't have anything to say, and it's completely legit. So those are easy to evade, not good creators of engagement. The next set, we've talked about flipping the lid, assumed consensus, assumptions about but don't you think we should make that pink? Those kinds of things. When you ask a question like that, you're telling someone that they need to combat you. They need to argue against you. You require conflict to answer that question. Not a safe thing to do. Avoid those when possible. And then the final set that are really challenging are these giant, vague questions. You know, what should we do next, right? Big question. People will take a long time to think through that before you're going to get a good result. So there are a couple techniques here that help create better questions. There are also lots of great example questions you can find on the internet and in guidebooks. But let's talk about some techniques. The first one is the vivid question. So I just mentioned how you can ask a question that's too big and too vague and people can't see their answers. The vivid question helps people literally visualize the situation that you're asking them about so that the answer is just natural. Here's an example. So let's say I'm sitting with my husband and I say, hey, what do you want to do for the holidays this year? He's likely to go, what? But instead, if I say, hey, I'm thinking about the holidays next year. When you think back to last year's holidays and all of the events that we attended and the people that we were with and what it was like to have to negotiate the icy roads and all the cooking and prep and meals we did as part of that, what do you think you want to do for the holidays this year? He's likely to have a better answer, or at least an answer. So that's technique number one. That comes from Michael Wilkinson and the folks at Leadership Strategies. Ask a better question. Number two. This one comes from Roger Schwartz, and what he's doing, his suggestion is to take your agenda topics and reword them as questions. So here we have a pretty typical agenda for like a status update. You know, hi, what are the updates, new issues, let's review, we're out of here, right? Very businesslike. But watch what happens when you take these topics and you reword them as questions. How is everyone doing? What did you accomplish? What new issues do we need to know about? What did we agree on in this meeting? When I see an agenda like this as a participant, the reason I need to go there, the answers I'm meant to give, what I will learn is incredibly clear. The relevance for me and my job is very clear when you reword your agenda topics as questions. It feels a little funny when you first start doing it. It feels a little weird, but it's very, very effective. So I suggest you consider this particular technique. All right, number 4, we are getting there. This one's a little counterintuitive, but it's embrace silence. I'm going to show you some specific ways to use silence powerfully to increase engagement. Silence in meetings lets you do things like give people time to think. Not everyone processes at the same speed. Introverts kind of need some space before they're ready to speak. It shows that answers are expected. I'll show you that one in a second. And it helps balance participation. Often, if you have enforced silence in your meetings, that is a time when no one else can be dominating that conversation. Okay? The first version of this is the 5-second rule. We learned this one from Wayne Termel. And what he does is when he asks a question, he counts to 5 before he moves on. Not questions, no questions. Questions? And then he moves on. That lets everybody know that you actually are waiting to hear that question come through. Now I'm showing hippopotamuses here because Wayne is a US-based guy like we are, and as children we're taught to count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. But he ran into an international audience and they said, yeah, we don't do Mississippi, we do hippopotamus. So 1 hippopotamus, 2 hippopotamus, that's your silence. The next one, you'll see us reference this technique all of the time, is silent brainstorming. You've asked for an answer. Instead of having people shout out their ideas, instead set a timer, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, have everybody write down their answers independently. So let's say that we've said, hey, what do you want to have as the animal mascot for our team? Each person could be writing down their answers, and some of them may be the same, but because they can't hear each other's answers, you might get wildly different input without undue influence from other folks. And then the final one is signaled intention and consensus. So you can get people to participate without having to speak. We talked about that earlier a little bit. Every once in a while, Trisha's been giving me thumbs up and waves and whatnot because she's keeping track of chat. I can't see it. These hand signals are hand signals that were adopted by the Occupy movement. They didn't invent them. Most of them come from earlier times. There's one here at the bottom. You get a crowd of people and they want to know how things are going. It's called twinkle fingers. It comes from the American Sign Language for, yay. And then when they agree, they do twinkle fingers. And then they reversed it. When they didn't agree, they did squid fingers. You can also do things like I want to talk and whatnot. Now, these are big ones for big groups. I do know of a team where they had a more subtle approach to this. As people would talk in a group of, say, 8, and once you were on board, you just raised your hand. Okay, I got it. I'm on board. And the minute everybody around the room had raised their hand, that person knew they were done. They could stop talking and they moved on. So developing hand signals is a way that you can get people involved. Yeah.
I thought I'd just share some of the things that were going on in the chat. Just as you were talking, it was kind of fun to see all the different feedback from people. Some say they've used silence before. It's very powerful. People
Good.
use it all the time. And there's one guy, Maurice from Canada, that says 1 Mississauga, 2 Mississauga is what they use in Canada.
Awesome.
Of course, John, who says that he has confirmed this with your 5-year-old. And if you need they need a little thought time, that can work really well with your kids. So it's not just in meetings. That can apply to your friends, your family. So that's pretty great.
That's cool. That's very cool. Okay, well, we're getting kind of close on time, so I'm going to go ahead and buzz through these last couple. Our master technique number 5 is the go around. Now, we've already talked a little bit about a couple of go arounds when we did check-ins. The go around's ancient. It's basically has its origins around the campfire. And the intention here is to get every voice heard. So the way a go around works is that everyone speaks who wishes to speak. They all share time equally-ish. And the important thing to keep in mind as a meeting leader is that the order of speakers changes your results, right? There are actually records of ancient fights about people coming to bloodshed to determine who could speak first in medieval meetings. Crazy stuff. So some psychology. If you want to make space for your internal processors and your introverts, you can use a go-around to do that. Do not start with them. What you want to do is you want to start with someone 1, 2, 3 people over, which gives them time in their minds to go ahead and formulate their answer before they're asked to speak. Also, don't end with them. Don't make them have the last word. So that's a way to get your internal folks involved. Similarly, you can use the go-around to moderate undue influence. And this is your folks like your boss, right? Once the boss speaks, the boss's opinion weighs heavy on everybody else. So don't start with them, don't end with them, and ideally don't put them before your introverts. If you've got a large enough group, you want to change your order that way. Same thing goes for your talkers, right? Your dominants who tend to occupy all of the air in the room. Don't put them first. Set a pattern that, we all speak for about a minute before they get their chance. Help model the behavior you're looking for there. Somebody in the questions earlier asked, how do we include remote participants? A go-around's a really natural way to do that. You can keep a list of all the folks there in your meeting, and then you make sure you call on them. That gives you an opportunity to make sure you're asking for their input. Okay, so that's some of the psychology benefits. Now, another thing you can do with a go-around, I learned this one from Diana Larson. This is a timed go-around. You can pass a clock, literally. So as the first person starts talking, the person next to them is watching. And when 2 minutes is up, they hand that person the clock. That's their signal that it's time to stop. and they watch the clock for the next person and they continue to pass it along. So keeping the go around, making sure the contributions fit within the time you have. You don't necessarily have to go around in a circle. You can have people volunteer for when they want to speak and pass something like a talking stick. This is a picture from last month. Susan Collins is a US Senator, and they were having shutdown negotiations, and she got these people in a room and she made them use a talking stick. You know, you're not allowed to speak unless you have the stick, right? It turned out to be really funny. They had a senator who was really excited, and somebody threw the stick at him and they broke stuff, and so they switched to a ball. And I've worked in teams where that has been the case too. We used a ball to toss back and forth about who was speaking next. So that's one way to manage that. And then when you get into a very, very large group, this technique, I learned this from Rick Lent. I've seen variations from several people. It's called 1-2-all. And it's also a great way to get your introverts involved. So you ask your great question, and then you, in 1 to 2 minutes, give everybody some silent individual reflection time. What is the answer I have for myself? And then they turn to a partner and they discuss that in pairs. And then after a period of time, you have the pairs report out to the whole group. So not everybody needs to necessarily speak in front of the whole group, but everybody's voice has been heard by at least one other person in the room. That's a great way to get people engaged and contributing. Okay, so that is the go around. I could do go arounds for an hour. There's all kinds of fascinating things about it. But before we do that, I want to, we're not going to do that. Before we go, I want to help show you a technique that puts them all together. This is the KJ technique. We use this in our kickoffs and our retrospectives and all of the time, and it works like this. Number one, you ask a question and then you have everybody do silent brainstorming. Okay, we talked about that one already. Next, you use a go around and you have people post their answers visually. So everybody's got their answers written down and they post them one at a time. We've got visual progress. We've got everybody involved. They had time to formulate their ideas without undue influence. Next, step 3, you have them do mute mapping. So everybody walks up to the ideas together. It's called mute because this is done without speaking. It's done in silence. And everybody moves those things around together until they feel like they're in groups of like items. Then, once everybody steps back from the board and they're happy with the groups, you name them. Go ahead and circle them, and the group comes up with names. Now, you know, you don't, as the leader, get to decide those names. The group decides the names. You might have thought this was strong animals, but this particular group, oh, they did say strong animals, and you might think this was aquatic, but they said pretty animals. And okay, bears, fine. And then once you have your groups in place, you have the group prioritize, your team prioritize which one they think they want to focus on. So in this case, we're looking at animal mascots, but this could be improvements we want to make to our process. Which one of these do we want to focus on, okay? Dot voting is usually the technique you use for this. Everybody gets, say, 3 dots. They can put them all on one thing if they want, or they can spread them out across multiple ideas. And then once everybody's dots are in, you say, oh, there's the winner. We're going with bears. Our mascot will be bears. So the KJ technique is a combo technique that that brings together all of our other techniques: silent brainstorming, go-arounds, mute mapping, naming the groups, and dot voting. That's our 6 master techniques. The check-in, make visible progress, ask better questions, remember to be quiet every once in a while, the go-around, and the KJ technique. So at this point, we've covered the challenges involved in increasing engagement. We've gone over some specific techniques. I hope you all have SMART goals. If you've got a SMART goal about something in this that you want to use, go ahead and add it in. We'd love to see that. And then before we finally break for questions, and we can stay a couple minutes late, I'm so sorry that we're going to be, squeezed at the end there. I do have one final tip. And this isn't something you do in a meeting. It's rather sort of something that you'd put in place for all your meetings. And it's a little bold and it's a little scary, but we've seen it work really well in several different organizations. And it's this: make all your meetings optional. Make them optional. If you want to increase engagement, make it so that only people who are interested in engaging have to attend. So everyone's attendance is optional, but if they attend, they are expected to be fully present, not to bring in other work or check their phones. For folks who are inviting irrelevant people to your meetings and you don't know like how to not do that, right? Like I always invite Sally because I'm afraid she'll be offended. This gives Sally a way to opt herself out, right? So that can be nicer for meeting leaders. It also means that if participants feel that the meeting that you're running isn't relevant to them, they'll stop showing up. So it's a forcing function, right? Meeting leaders run better meetings when they know that people won't come if they don't think it's relevant to their jobs. It's a simple policy on the surface. It's obviously more complex to implement in practice, but it works enormously well. And that's my final tip for you today. I'm happy to stay and take any questions.
Okay, yes, please everyone answer or ask any questions that you have. We have a few people that needed to drop off. We had some from Switzerland and other people have some meetings, so they're jumping off, but we do have a few people that one person has their hand raised, and that would be David. So David, please just go ahead and type your question into the chat if you don't mind. That would be great. I see that you have a question, so that would be wonderful. Everyone is also saying how great the webinar was. They are
good.
So happy to have seen these tips. They, basically love the tips and can't wait to use them. A lot of people like the silence bit. Some people liked the, or actually someone just said they just started using our templates this week. That's great.
Oh, cool.
Thank you, Maurice.
Well, I gotta say, I have, it was hard to pick 6, and I heard from my facilitator friends a 7th that I could not fit into today, so I have snuck it into the follow-up email. So when we get the follow-up email, watch out. There's a 7th technique embedded in the follow-up as a bonus. So
awesome. So Maurice actually said he used it so many times, I guess last year. Actually, he's saying he used our templates, but a lot of people have, let's see, just a lot of thanks. Great tips, great tips. They need to go run their check-in, Tracy said. So thanks for the webinar.
I know there are some people who had very specific questions that we weren't able to handle today. I appreciate having heard those. And if you want to send us an email, we'll be happy to try and deal with those separately. So
yes, definitely.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we're done. 2 minutes is not terrible over time. If you want to learn more, you can definitely see us on our website, connect with us on Twitter and LinkedIn, and then watch your email. Feel free to reply to that with any other questions. And hopefully if you enjoyed this, you'll also like our course that's coming shortly. So keep an eye out for that.
Right.